This fighter jet was supposed to be the one to take over the world. Born in the Soviet Union, the MiG-23 was designed as a multi-role fighter meant not only to match the West and their newfangled toys, but to surpass them entirely. Capable of reaching speeds of over Mach 2, it was equipped with an array of guns and missiles, electronic warfare systems, advanced radar, and it had a production run exceeding 5,000 units. So why is it broadly regarded as an abject failure? It is not described as merely underwhelming, but as a complete and utter disaster from top to bottom, so much so that it has even been reduced to a punchline in aviation circles. How can we untangle this conundrum? When we evaluate the MiG-23 today with the benefit of hindsight of decades, what do we really see? Is this truly the worst fighter jet of all time? Or is there more to the story? A Brave New World. So, what is the origin story of the MiG-23? Well, picture this. It's the late 1960s, and the Cold War is in full swing. We're only a few years removed from the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie and the Cuban Missile Crisis. With thousands of nuclear missiles pointed at cities and military installations around the world, the chance for global conflict wasn't just high, it was seen as nearly inevitable. The US was already deep into developing its next generation of aircraft, which were expected to vanquish the Red Menace once and for all. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, and the F-111 Aardvark all showcased impressive technological innovations for their time. The F-4 was a twin-engine, Mach 2 capable fighter that excelled in dogfights while housing effective armaments to strike multiple targets. It quickly became the US military's go-to fighter across the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. With its powerful state-of-the-art radar and high-performance specifications, it proved to be a reliable and formidable aircraft in operational use. The F-105 was both a fighter and a bomber, capable of reaching Mach 2 as well. It would eventually earn its own controversial legacy. Be sure to check out our video on that after this one for the full scoop. But at the time of its development, it was a capable aircraft that served the US Armed Forces for decades in various theaters of combat, including Vietnam. Meanwhile, the F-111 was a multi-role combat aircraft with a new sci-fi look. It was the first aircraft to feature a variable sweep wing, commonly known as a swing wing, which allows the wing positions to be modified in flight for different uses. These aircraft can have the wings splayed out or swept back, depending on the situation. In the end, the F-111 would also be considered more trouble than it was worth, although the Soviets could never have known that at the time. So, here were the capitalists with all their fancy new planes, while the Soviet Union relied on the MiG-21, a lightning-fast and highly nimble fighter that unfortunately was limited by its age. The aircraft had a short range, a primitive radar system compared to its Western counterparts, a limited weapons load, and ultimately an operational capability that just fell short for a global superpower trying to assert its influence across the planet.
Just before we continue today, did you know there's a good chance that your personal info, like your name, maybe an old address, your phone number even, definitely your email address, could be floating around on some sketchy website that you've never heard of? You didn't put it there, but somehow, well, there it is. Well, Incogni, today's sponsor, helps remove your personal data from data broker and people search sites. With their new unlimited plan, you could take things even further though. If you found your information on sites like whitepages.com or unicourt.com or trellis.law, where you just copy the link, you drop it into Incogni's dashboard, and their team will start work on removing it, even if it's not one of their standard partners. This is called custom removals, and it means you're no longer stuck just hoping that your data disappears, because it won't. If you take action, though, Incogni will follow through. There's no forms, there's no complicated requests. You just paste that link and they handle it. So, take personal data back with Incogni. Just go to incogni.com/megaprojects and use the code MEGAPROJECTS to get 60% off an annual plan. And now back to today's episode.
For the Soviets, and you'll have to pardon the pun here, that just couldn't fly. Soviet authorities, along with the communist nations that had purchased Russian technology, grew increasingly disappointed with the MiG-21 day by day. The military had no choice but to develop a new aircraft, one that could challenge these modern American capitalist planes, and emerge victorious. They needed an upgrade across the board, and unfortunately for them, they were already working on what they believed would be just that. Development had already begun by the late 1960s. Today, planes can take decades to develop, but back then, fueled by the power of Soviet engineering, prototypes were rolling out in 1967 following a successful first flight that April. That same year, the aircraft was first showcased at Domodedovo Airport during a Moscow air show. Notably, an airshow featuring the swing wing design, like that of the Aardvark, eventually became the basis for the MiG-23 that we know today. Introduced in 1970, the aircraft entered service by 1971 and was being produced in abundance by 1973. NATO gave it the code name Flogger, and it soon became one of the most popular aircraft in the entire world. So, what made it so unique, and how was it going to challenge the Western designs? Well, let's find out, shall we? Design: a clean sweep. The MiG-23 was developed as a smaller aircraft compared to its main rival, the F-4. It measured approximately 16.5 meters in length and had a nearly 14-meter wingspan when fully extended. However, its swing-wing configuration allowed the wingspan to be reduced mid-flight to just over 7.7 meters. Standing around 4.8 meters tall, the MiG-23 was generally smaller than aircraft like the F-111 and the F-4 Phantom, both of which were twin-engine designs requiring a crew of two. This single-pilot setup also resulted in a slightly smaller radar signature, a valuable asset for a multi-role fighter. Now, this aircraft was powered by a Kachaturov R-35-300 afterburning turbojet. And if that name hints at speed, well, that's because it delivered on speed. The MiG-23 was absolutely blisteringly quick. It was capable of traveling up to Mach 2.35 or around 2,445 kilometers per hour, though that speed was reached only at its peak altitude of roughly 18,000 meters or 60,000 feet. At sea level, its top speed was closer to Mach 1.14 or 1,350 kilometers an hour, placing it right up there with the F-4 Phantom in terms of speed and altitude. Now, in theory, that made it a remarkably versatile craft for both air-to-air and air-to-ground engagements. It was also effective for reconnaissance, a valuable trait during the Cold War when you could never have too many eyes in the sky. In addition, it was equipped with powerful onboard sensors and a modern, for the time, radar system, which helped to take early steps into electronic warfare capabilities. Among its many variants was the MiG-23 MLD, which was particularly strong in the avionics department, another string to the MiG's bow. It featured more robust landing gear than its predecessor, which allowed it to be utilized on short, remote runways, whether on an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic or on rural strips in Africa. This was the Cold War, and a key component of vehicle development was the ability to sell them worldwide as a form of both influence and revenue. Its short takeoff and landing, or STOL capabilities, made it far more versatile in various environments. The F-4 didn't have that, arguably giving the MiG a unique selling point over its rival. Moreover, since it needed to be effective around the globe, its range of just over 2,800 kilometers when equipped with drop tanks ensured it could absolutely get around. For reference, that's roughly the distance in a straight line from Moscow to Dublin, so it's safe to say that this plane could meet the Soviet Union's needs for covering all of Europe, with variants potentially serving other nations as well. It's important to note, however, that this range refers to ferrying capabilities, not combat range, which was significantly shorter. As far as armaments go, the MiG was pretty well armed. It featured a single 23mm GSH-23R cannon loaded with 200 rounds. With a minimum rate of fire of 3,400 rounds per minute, it could theoretically expend all of its ammunition in 3 seconds. On top of that, the aircraft had 7 exterior hardpoints for mounting additional weapon systems capable of carrying up to almost 3,000 kilograms of ordnance, including air-to-air missiles, air-to-surface missiles, bombs, and rocket pods for ground attack roles. It was even capable of what the newest Western jets could do, striking targets beyond visual range. Additionally, there was a robust program in place to advance the MiG's technology as it progressed further into its service life, theoretically ensuring that it would be able to keep up in the arms race as technology continued to evolve. Pretty impressive stuff, all things considered, you probably agree. Or was it? Because for all of its achievements and its impressive specifications, the MiG-23 today is regarded as a laughingstock, a global joke of a multi-role fighter. So why? Why does it have such a reputation? On paper, this is a perfectly serviceable aircraft. In some respects, it could even be considered superior in terms of practicality. But look, war's not fought on paper, is it? A closer look at the MiG's litany of issues is gonna reveal why it really does suck. Reality. Crash and burn. So, what were the issues with this seemingly pretty good plane? Well, for starters, there were the issues with the core design. As the US found out with the F-111 Aardvark, the MiG's swing-wing system was a nice addition, but it wasn't a game changer, and it also made the aircraft highly expensive to maintain. They were maintenance intensive, complex to understand, and heavier when compared to Western-style multi-role fighters at the time. The F-111, while being considered something of a meme itself, didn't end up as the key multi-role fighter for the US for this very reason. Instead, the F-4 took that role. The MiG shared many of the same issues. However, since it was Moscow's newest premier jet and the only option available, Russia and countries within its sphere of influence were saddled with a difficult and temperamental machine. Its engines also had a short service life. After all that speed comes at a cost, which made maintenance even more astronomically expensive. But at this point you might be thinking, well, okay, so what? I mean, every plane in US history has been highly expensive to maintain and also really, really complicated. And that's true. We shouldn't consider the MiG a bad plane for being difficult or expensive to maintain. However, the Cold War, it was a game of logistics. The MiG was considered a handful by engineers, even compared to other jets of the time. The more maintenance a plane requires and the more expensive that maintenance is, the fewer planes you can have in the sky at once. This could be a strategic vulnerability, leaving your best plane outnumbered in a large-scale conflict. Because of this, other Warsaw Pact regions, including Russia itself, chose not to retire the MiG-21 as previously planned. Despite the mass production of the MiG-23, they opted to operate both planes together to bulk up their numbers. This factor gave the MiG a merely serviceable and highly utilitarian reputation from the start. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that in theory, but if your best plane relies on its outdated predecessor for support, something's clearly gone awry in the design process. Moreover, in any large-scale conflict, the MiG-21s would be no match for more advanced Western technology. And look, when you examine its specifications, they're impressive. But unfortunately for Moscow, they're not revolutionary. Consider its speed. Roughly on par with the F-4, yet the F-111 Aardvark, the plane sharing the same design, was quicker at top speed. The MiG's range with drop tanks is decent, however the Aardvark boasted over double that range without the need for refueling. Meanwhile, many iterations of the F-4 also employed drop tanks, resulting in a much longer total ferrying range than the MiG. Okay, so it couldn't fly as far and was about average in speed. What about agility and firepower? After all, this is a Russian plane. It should be able to dogfight with the best of them and be as agile as a hummingbird. So, let's talk agility. Consider those drop tanks for a second, and those external hardpoints too. Every time you bolt something onto a plane, it adds weight, and that extra weight demands more fuel, further reducing the effective range. It also affects agility. Imagine strapping a weighted vest to yourself and attempting a backflip, or just attempting a backflip anyway, and you'll see what we mean. Don't do that though, it's dangerous, you'll hurt yourself. People said at the time that the MiG-23 flew like a bullet. But unfortunately, it turned like a bullet as well. When you add the weight to the swing wing design, you have a machine that was exceptionally difficult to control. Almost everyone who flew a MiG-23 documented just how challenging it was to handle. You certainly wouldn't want that in your primary multi-role fighter, would you? And the point is, this difficulty didn't necessarily make for an effective dogfighter, which was a key element of Soviet air doctrine at the time. Heck, it wasn't even as agile as the MiG-21, let alone anything the West was developing. Really, despite being described as a fighter, the MiG-23 was no Ivan Drago. The pilot's vision in the cockpit was hindered by the raised fuselage spine and the high-mounted wings. One of the most important aspects of a fighter aircraft is being able to see clearly both to the sides and behind you. After all, that's exactly where enemy planes are likely to attack from. And, as I'm sure you're aware, having your vision hindered, not great. Then you have to consider its combat record, which, following what we just talked about, probably doesn't surprise you that it's a bit poor. When pitted against rival Western equipment, it has a long and well-documented history of falling far short. During the various Arab-Israeli wars, over a dozen Syrian MiG-23 fighters were shot down by Israeli F-15s and F-16s. The Iraqi military fared even worse against Iranian F-14s, F-4s, and F-5s during the Iran-Iraq War, reportedly suffering over 50 losses. In the Tobruk skirmish in 1989, 2 MiG-23s were destroyed by US F-14 Tomcats. In the Lebanon War of 1982, Israel shot down MiG-23s in large numbers. Perhaps the biggest indignity of all occurred during the Libyan-Egyptian War of 1977, when Egyptian MiG-21s routinely outperformed Libyan MiG-23s. Mark Episkopos, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute's Eurasia program and professor of history at Marymount University in Arlington, said of the plane, and we'll quote him here, "There is no ambiguity here. The MiG-23 boasts a long, well-documented, and deeply embarrassing service record." Savage. On top of that, the aircraft suffered from a difficult safety record, with several accidents occurring over its life cycle. In 1989, a pilot was forced to eject over Poland due to engine trouble, yet the MiG-29 continued flying all the way to Belgium, where it ultimately crashed into a house and killed a farmer. There are other similar incidents, both in and out of combat, where persistent maintenance issues made themselves known. One even crashed at a Michigan air show in 2023. Throughout history, there are countless accounts of these aircraft seemingly just falling out of the sky. And remember that fancy new radar? It became remarkably easy to jam with Western electronic and avionic warfare suites. This was a turning point in the global arms race, when Western military technology and innovation generally pulled ahead. The USSR certainly had its moments. After all, these are the same people who put a man in space for the first time. But in terms of standard military technology, they were beginning to fall behind. And then you have the armaments, which were neither more nor less impressive than what the Department of Defense already possessed. For example, the F-4 Phantom could carry significantly more ordnance simply because it was bigger. And when you put all these factors together, you end up with an aircraft that can generously be described as a jack of all trades and a master of none. If you're not being kind, you might call it a disaster. You might call it shit. It was outgunned every time it faced the types of machines it was designed to combat. Yet there may be reasons to believe that this jet does have a few redeeming qualities that its detractors fail to acknowledge. The MiG-23, a fair legacy. Alright, I should probably explain that because I've just spent the best part of 10 to 15 minutes dragging the M23 through the mud, and that can't be good for the health of its unreliable engines. There are ways to justify that the MiG-23 wasn't the worst fighter plane ever, and that it may even have some redeeming features. There's an interesting debate to be had here, and even if you don't immediately agree with this perspective, you might at least appreciate the fair counterpoints. In total, more than 5,000 MiG-23s were built, many not for Russia itself, but for the rest of the Soviet Union. A significant number were forcibly built and shipped to countries within the Warsaw Pact. These nations were compelled to use them, although many other countries ended up purchasing a substantial number of these aircraft. Call it geopolitical wrangling, but the M23, despite its flaws, was a commercial success among, for example, many Arab nations. They weren't communists, they could buy whatever aircraft they wanted. They picked the MiG, but this does call into question what it was really built for. If you want to make money, set up a lemonade stand. When you're outfitting a military, is profit really the priority? After all, wars are not fought on paper, and all the invoices and orders in the world won't stop the MiG-23 from being unreliable and poor in combat. Fair enough, but that money also went into other projects that helped spread influence for Soviet military tech throughout much of the world. If not a military victory, perhaps it could be considered an economic or a cultural one. Kinda. Look, as we said, that influence can't compensate for its overall poor performance on the battlefield, even if it does offer a redeeming quality. And there's also a reason the MiG-23s exported to the rest of the world didn't fare as well. They were largely the standard base export model. Meanwhile, you remember all those variants that we mentioned earlier? Some of them did go to other countries, but Moscow always secured the most advanced versions. And look, we get a guess here, but there may have been an element of distrust in the Soviet House. Moscow may not have wanted the rest of the Warsaw Pact and the world to have the top-shelf versions of the MiG, since it needed them for itself in case war came, and Moscow could never be seen with an inferior version compared to another nation. As a result, other countries received versions equipped with more outdated equipment. As it advanced over time, the mostly Russian-exclusive versions of the MiG became quite capable overall. Was the MiG going to be the plane finally to topple the West? No, not at all. However, its variants have at least in part tried to make up for its overall shortcomings. Thus, the true potential of the MiG remains hidden behind a perception that doesn't truly reflect its top-level performance. And yet perception is reality in many ways. If the MiG was seen as bad because the inferior ones Russia exported to other nations performed poorly, then the MiG is just bad. It doesn't matter what Moscow's MiG-23s did, since they very rarely encountered real combat against near peers. We've got really little to measure by, and in absence of anything else, one must take the existing combat record as it lies. And that's unavoidably poor. It's like saying you could have been better at basketball than Michael Jordan if it wasn't for that pesky knee injury. It doesn't make it true, and you did have the injury. So what are people supposed to believe? Moreover, considering how badly they matched up against the export versions of the Western equivalents, who's to say that an upgraded version would have fared any better when facing one of Washington's own stock? Of course, the training and maintenance of those countries makes a difference, as do factors like strategy and doctrine. That's why Egyptian MiG-21s could defeat Syrian MiG-23s. However, the fact that such a contest even occurred highlights how the MiG-23 was limited by these factors. And when you consider that they struggled across the board, it might well be indicative of an inherently inferior aircraft with an equally inferior design. But it did have longevity, if nothing else. It wasn't pulled from Russian service until the 90s, and some even remained in service with former Soviet partners like Angola, Ethiopia, North Korea, and Syria. If it were truly the worst aircraft ever, even for those nations, it would have surely been moved on by now. Clearly, it still has a small part to play. Overall, the view of the MiG-23 as an utter disaster might be a bit too harsh. In the end, it was an impressive and ambitious design that, at least in theory, could match some of the better Western planes of the era. It enjoyed far more success than the F-111, for example, even though it wasn't as fast. The MiG-23 was a decent, serviceable aircraft despite having major flaws, such as its terrible matchups against Western counterparts. Yet it did fall short of its intended roles as the plane to double the West and as a formidable air superiority fighter. That shortfall is hard to dispute. Still, one could argue that it wasn't the worst military aircraft of all time. After all, it became one of the most mass-produced and ubiquitous fighter jets ever built, a combination that, while not impossible, is quite unlikely. Eventually, the MiG-23 was replaced by the MiG-29. Whatever you think of this plane, whether you consider it underrated or fairly panned, you can't deny that it resembled a global Soviet fashion trend. Almost everybody just had to have one. Thank you for watching.